Everybody's got a plan, but what happens when you get punched in the mouth? That's what we're exploring here with the Offseason Blueprint and the 2025 offseason plan we've laid out this week, here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting, author of Touchdown Miami on Substack, the NFL draft lead for the 33rd team. I want to give a special welcome and shout out to our everydayers because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, FanDuel customers, you get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet with FanDuel wins. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. This week on the show, whether it was Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we did the whole gambit, and we put together a fully simulated offseason with what my plan would look like if I were in the captain's chair and running the Dolphins, with the objective being trying to put together a competitive roster for the 2025 season so that we can win enough football games to have the kind of team success that's going to allow us as the collective brain trust that runs the Dolphins to continue to run the Dolphins, but also position yourself better for a multi-year competitive window. That's a fine line to have to walk. But we, throughout the course of this 2025 Miami Dolphins offseason blueprint, we took a look at some primary objectives on what we wanted to do to achieve that feat, whether that was salary cap health, getting more physical, mitigating injury risk, collecting more dogs for the rosters, or getting younger. Then we retained players off of last year's roster. We did a simulated offseason. But the thing that really prompted me to lean into this being the Friday show is when you're getting projections and whispers, and Pro Football Focus just put out their graphic for Javon Holland's projected contract, and it's 4 years, $96 million or $98 million. Is like crazy amounts of money. And the question is, and I've heard from a number of you, like, what happens if the guard market goes crazy this year like it did last year when Robert Hunt gets $20 million and you're rightfully not in the market to spend $20 million for Robert Hunt? And I love Robert Hunt. I'd love to have Robert Hunt back. What happens if Trayvon Moehrig, the safety, Kyle, that you have projected in the offseason blueprint as one of your critical signings, your quality starter ad as a 25-year-old starting safety, you projected $12 million a season? What happens if the safety market does go nuts and he's a $17 million a year player? You can't get into that deep end of the pool if you're the Dolphins. And that is an unfortunate reality. And I think one of the bigger things that when we finished the show yesterday, we got into the Dolphins and the cash budget that this kind of offseason plan that we put together had illustrate, which has the Dolphins spending over $315 million in cash this season, but against a $279 million salary cap. That would be the lowest cash over cap ratio the Dolphins have played at in the last 6 years. So that's a significant deal to have regressed back your cash over cap ratio, and doing so in a way that allows you to put together a roster, both on the offensive and defensive side of the ball, that we feel like can compete. I feel like the budget is equally important to allocating talent because the budget and how you go about doing that, allocating a whole bunch of draft picks, that's what's going to allow you to, the short term of collecting talent allows you to keep your job after this year. But the budget allows you to keep yourself in your job after this year while simultaneously being in a position to continue to compete and not put yourself right back on the hot seat. So I try to hold this budget, if I could, if I were the Dolphins, as tight to what it's currently projected at in this kind of blueprint. And if that means that maybe you have to say farewell to adding Joe Noteboom as your utility offensive lineman because the Will Fries market, if you really like Will Fries and you want to add him as a 26-year-old guard with starting experience in Indianapolis, if the 3-year, $36 million contract projection there is too much of a low ball offer, then maybe you take the Joe Nobu money and you add it to the Will Fries contract. But what happens if Aaron Banks, instead of getting 8, what happens if he gets 14? So what I have is a number of different names that I want to invoke here as far as being viable backup plans at some of these position groups for the Dolphins. I have it up on the other screen here. It's just names. I didn't do graphics for this, but for the rest of the segments, we are going to do some graphics that I'll be talking through if you're just listening to the show. But let's start on the offensive line, because I know that's where everybody's mind is at. If the Dolphins find themselves not in a position to play in the financial pool of what Will Fries and Aaron Banks as the two potential starters that I have soft circled as like, these are my targets, this is my budget. If those dollars don't work out, a couple other names to know. That includes James Daniels, who is probably the most accomplished player on this list, but is coming off of a season-ending Achilles injury in his late 20s. That does not fall in line with the mitigate injury risk and get younger objectives that we are trying to pursue with this offseason. But you're playing in an imperfect world in this sandbox with 31 other teams that have their own dreams and aspirations of improving their own rosters with the same talent pool that you are. So you may have to bend. If you're going to bend, maybe you need to get a little creative. I would look at Josh Myers from the Green Bay Packers. You go back to Ohio State, dude's been a center for forever, but he's 6'3", 310 pounds, played in Green Bay, so there's obviously some familiarity with the core concepts in the run game and the terminology that this offense uses because it's off of another branch of the Kyle Shanahan coaching tree. You got creative with Aaron Brewer and played him at guard, or played him at center when he was at guard. Can you take Josh Myers and give him an equivalent to a John Runyon Jr. type contract like the Giants gave another Green Bay Packers free agent offensive lineman last year, which I believe was 3 for $30? No, if Will Fries is priced out at 18 and you can't play in that ballpark, maybe Josh Myers is a potential guard as a projection you can kind of take a leap of faith on. If Aaron Banks, because he had 2 years of starting and then this past year missed a couple of games, but at the end of the day, he's a 3-year established starter in San Francisco and you feel like his best football is ahead of him. If he gets up into the $13, $14 million range, I think you could still pick him over Will Fries and then just budget your Will Fries money elsewhere. But now you're getting into names like potentially Tevin Jenkins from Chicago, Will Hernandez from the Arizona Cardinals, who's 30 coming off of a season-ending injury. A little bit more of a stylistic, different kind of player. I know there's been some buzz on that being a potential fit all throughout the offseason thus far. And if you sign Will Hernandez, that's fine because I think that budget's probably his last contract was a $4.5 million APY. So that's, I think, the pivot that you can make, but you're putting yourself a little bit more into a corner where now you probably have to draft a guy a little earlier, and now you're risking drafting for need. But if you added one of Will Fries and Aaron Banks, and that was budgeted $20 million between those two players on an annual average basis. And I had both of those guys down for 3-year deals. So if you're only comfortable spending for one of those two players, that's where the short-term contract for Will Hernandez or the short-term contract for James Daniels, or maybe you roll the dice with Josh Myers with a position change. Well, those are some of the pivots that I think you can make if the Aaron Banks, Will Fries, hey, we really want these guys, but the market goes nuts and loco like it did last year, where you had Kevin Dotson was getting over $16 million, Jonah Jackson was getting over $16 million, Damian Lewis got $13 million. And I remember Damian Lewis was on the blueprint last year, and we had him down for like $8 or $9 million was the forecasted budget, and he went for 13.5. You find out the dollar amount, you say, well, yeah, I'm not paying that. So that's a few more names that I would bring to the table. I'd also mention Patrick McCarry from Baltimore. I think his guard tackle flexibility, it'd be spending more than what I think Joe Noteboom would cost. I think Macari is going to have some suitors to sign him as a starter. But I think you could probably, if that's your other player, and then you discard the Joe Noteboom signing and say, we definitely know we need to draft somebody with guard tackle flexibility, whether that's Miles Frazier from LSU, who's played guard and tackle for the LSU Tigers in the middle rounds, or whatever else. You could go with Macari as a pivot for a starter. You could go with Hernandez as a pivot as a starter. You could go for Josh Myers and change positions as a pivot as a starter. You could go for Tevin Jenkins as a little bit more of a high-risk signing, but that's probably more of a short-term deal. Mekhi Becton obviously had the big glow-up in Philadelphia, but he's playing between Cam Jurgens and Lane Johnson, and Jeff Stoutland's the best offensive line coach in the league, and he's had his own injury issues in years past, and Lord knows if the Dolphins sign him and he reverted back to having injury issues like he had in the past, the fan base would say, oh, well, you sign another injury-prone offensive lineman. So with that one, you're kind of darned if you do and darned if you don't. I have some more pivots on the defensive side of the ball I want to get into, a couple pivots at quarterback, and then I want to get into the 3-year salary cap outlook that this blueprint budget, maybe not the exact cap figures, because I don't expect this to be the exact outcome for the Dolphins and their 53 roster, but if you stay tight on budget with where we're forecasting in this, and you bring that cap over cash budget down, what does that look like for your salary cap health next year? We'll get into that next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins, so make sure you guys stick with us. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it all than over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off, or if you want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on all of the action. And if you're looking for bigger payouts, you can combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting, whether you're backing your favorite team on that late-game rally, or if you're hoping for a player to hit a clutch 3, you never miss your chance. The app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet with FanDuel wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. So quick recap for those of you. If you missed the rest of the week, please go check it out. It's some of our best programming of the year. It's my favorite exercise that we do on an annual basis. But with the 2025 Miami Dolphins offseason blueprint, we do have 53-man forecasts on either side of the ball that includes some more spent depth on wide receiver, some significant Tua Tagovailoa insurance, kind of an overhauled offensive line with new names in Aaron Banks and Will Fries and Jalen Travis in the draft, and Joe Noteboom, and we're bringing back Keon Smith, and the Dolphins did that one in reality already. Some young competition in the draft for the tight end room. And then on the defensive side of the ball, 60% of the starting secondary is new. We did not choose at the top of this exercise to assume Bradley Chubb was going to take a 50% pay cut, so that's already a difference in reality from what the blueprint had that I did and had prepped for the start of the week versus where we already are. And tracking those changes will be fun. But I want to get into the 3-year salary cap health and outlook because I think it is helpful to identify what this pathway creates for the Dolphins year over year. And you're projecting growth for the cap that is probably on the conservative side. My cap growth, that should not have been a tongue twister, forecasting gives you a look at what happens if the cap continues to grow at the rate historically that has grown, not in the 3-year sample size in which it's grown. So I think it's pretty safe to assume the salary cap in 2026 will be over $300 million. But for our forecast, we're forecasting $299 is our salary cap growth. Versus this year was 279.2. So it's about $20 million bump, but that's not the rate it's been growing. If it grows by $20 million, The Dolphins, with the blueprint and budget, with the contracts that we gave out all throughout the course of the week, with free agency, the new rookie contracts, the players you brought back, the contract restructures that pushed more out into the future years, your starting salary cap commitments will be $343 million. So you're about $44.5 million against the salary cap. But there's a couple of things, if you notice, that we did not do with this year's blueprint. And that includes, we did not touch Tua Tagovailoa's contract because I want the long-term flexibility there for, are we going to continue to have durability issues and availability problems? And if the answer there is yes, I don't want to defer another $20 million this year into future years. That makes this a more rigid contract that we don't have flexibility with. We also didn't touch Tyreek Hill with his whopping $51.89 million salary cap hit for 2026. We did not touch his contract this year at all because I know that's a massive number, and I know the Dolphins are going to need to leave and get out of that number. The 2027 forecast projecting for another about $17 million in cap growth. And again, I think that's extremely conservative. I would not be surprised if the 2026 cap, when it's all said and done, ends up being like 310, and then the 2027 cap ends up being 330. But the 3-year snapshot at 2027 would leave you with about $65.8 million in cap space, with a grand total of, as things currently stand, that's 35, 34, 30, about 26 players under contract in 2027. So about half of a 53-man roster with $65.8 million in cap space. And obviously that there's a lot that will change, and there's a lot of mechanics that have to be used for the 2026 cap space. But with this budget that we have, and this was with a Bradley Chubb post-June 1st cut, which obviously is not coming. So how you budget needs to be handled differently in reality. But the blueprint plan had you at about $17.5 million in cap space while allocating funds for the practice squad and accounting for all of your dead money for the contracts that you got out. $44.5 million against the cap in 2026 might sound intimidating until you consider, I think it's very well established, if Tyreek Hill is on the roster this year, it's the last year in which he's on the roster. The problem with the current salary cap tools of overthecap.com and spottrack.com and their salary cap calculators is you can do a post-June 1st or a pre-June 1st cut for Tyreek Hill for 2026, and it says you're going to save $36 million in cap space, but that's not exactly true, because in August this year, Tyreek is getting a approximately $16 million option bonus that is automatically scheduled to be split across the next 5 seasons of salary cap. And if you move on from Tyreek Hill after this year, that means 4/5 or 80% of that $16 million option bonus is going to be in future years cap space that then would be added to your dead cap. So if you moved on from Tyreek Hill after the 2025 season, if he played this year and then you presumably pre-June 1st cut him because you can't carry a $51 million cap charge. You just can't. I mean, that's way too large of a number versus what you need. The rest of his money that would become dead money would accelerate up into 2026. That's a $28 million dead cap charge, but that's still $23 million in cap savings. That's more than half of what you need to become salary cap compliant. Hypothetically speaking, if we're going to speak in hypotheticals, things go well in 2026 with Tua Tagovailoa. That contract in itself has almost $30.5 million of restructure potential at its disposal. So say you do the maximum restructure with Tua Tagovailoa if it goes well. We could now put yourself in a position where you are $9 million salary cap compliant by simply moving on from Tyreek Hill, which has always been the plan for 2026, unless you were going to do something else from an extension standpoint, which feels as hypothetically optimistic as I can get to say we're going to be in a position to max restructure Tua Tagovailoa's contract. I am not going to be optimistic to the degree in which we would suggest we'd have something else going on with Tyreek Hill. So that would get you salary cap compliant with just moving on from one player. And then obviously your objective next offseason would be replacing that player. But there are other moves that you can make with some of these new contracts that you added to the books. say the Trayvon Moehrig contract. As just an example, it was a projected 3-year, $36 million contract. In that year 2 of that contract is $12 million in base salary. You received a signing bonus that was prorated out across the 3 years plus 2 years on the back end. So it was $1.5 million per season for 5 years was the salary cap commitment for the signing bonus. And then he gets a $12 million base. If you have $4 million left, you could take $10 million of that and you could restructure $10 million of Trayvon Moehrig's $12 million base and split it across the next 4 years. And you'd only be accountable for 2.5 of that $10 million. So you would save another $7.5 million in cap space for Trayvon Moehrig by restructuring that base salary and knocking that figure down to $6 million. And now you have $16 million in cap space, and you restructured 2 contracts and moved on from Tyreek Hill. And you can do that with base salaries that exist $10 million or significant, let's just say significant. Nate Hobbs with the projected free agent signing is 6.8. Moehrig, as we mentioned, is 12. Jalen Ramsey has a $10 million base salary. Maybe you don't want to do that one because, well, that's a corner that's getting on the wrong side of 30. Can he play safety for you? What's the long-term outlook there? I don't know. Jordan Brooks has $7.8 million base salary. Zach Sealer probably going to be due for a contract renegotiation extension, whether that happens this year or next year. He's currently scheduled for $7.5 million base salary. That would definitely be an extension candidate because 2025-6 would be the last year of his deal. But we projected signing Will Fries for the same contract as Trayvon Moehrig. Whoever that guard is, whether it's Will Fries or one of the plan Bs and backups, if it's in that dollar amount that we projected, it's another $12 million base. You could restructure and get another $7 million in cap space, just like we did with the Moehrig contract. Austin Jackson's due for almost $10 million base salary. You've got Marcus Mariota with a $5 million base. And then you have guys in contract years like Alec Ingold, who's got $3.5 million base salary that you could potentially clear out. Josh Palmer's a guy that we signed for a depth guy to a multi-year contract that has almost $4 million in flexibility with how you want to choose to handle some of that base salary. We projected another guard for a competitive starting market. So you add all of those things up, and then very quickly you can be back in a position, and then you're through after 2026, the $28 million in dead cap for moving on from Tyreek Hill next offseason, hypothetically, and then the other $29 million in dead cap that we're projecting that you need to get rid of for Bradley Chubb and Teron Armstead and moving out of their contracts. So you put all that together, and that's what the multi-year outlook looks like. And then you're through the prorated commitments of those big 4 contracts that we talked about all throughout the course of the offseason. And it allows you a chance to kind of reset the deck. Speaking of those big 4 contracts, I want to talk about Tyreek Hill. And I want to talk about Bradley Chubb, who we just got some news from Tom Pelissero on not that long ago. That's coming your way next here on Locked On Dolphins. Stick with us. All right, so let's tackle a different element of some of these big contracts. I want to look at the Tyreek Hill situation in a vacuum, where Tyreek Hill, I know what I would do, right? And I would find an opportunity to transition away from Tyreek Hill this offseason. I did not do that in the blueprint because it is a very unpredictable thing to try to project. And it also just so happens to be a contract that has a lot of layers to it. And finding and knowing that you have a replacement to the degree in which they're going to be satisfactory with, knowing predictably that they may very well be invested here to try to make this work, no matter how bad of an idea I feel like that is a reality I think we have to brace for. So when you look at the Tyreek Hill contract, and I know we mentioned this element of it already, but this option bonus that he is due in August of this year for $15.85 million is a big deal because that is what creates the extra backlog. I mean, you are talking about, if he plays on the roster this year after you pay him the option bonus, it's another $12.6 million in prorated money that goes into the dead cap for 2026. So in a perfect world, you do find the opportunity to move on and trade Tyreek Hill. And if that happens post June 1st, I would rather just do the break even and get it all out of the way this year before you pay him this option bonus for $15.85 million. And then this base salary is also fully guaranteed of $10 million. So that's guaranteed money. He's guaranteed this year's salary. If you can trade it and you can offload it and all of this goes away, what you're left with is a grand total of $28.29 million in dead money. You could take it on the nose and take it this year, and that's why we didn't touch the Tyreek contract, because it would be break even. Or if you did it post June 1st, you'd be responsible for the 2025 salary cap commitment in 2025, which would be 12.7. And then in 2026, you'd be responsible for a grand total of 15.5. That is much more easily digestible than paying him this, knowing it's a bomb that's waiting to go off from a locker room and culture and the way that things ended last year. That to me is much more digestible. And then what that does from a salary cap health standpoint for you, I mean, if you're telling me you're going to take a $15 million dead cap for Tyreek Hill in 2026, now you would be just salary cap compliant without doing any of the restructures to Tua Tagovailoa or anybody else, and doing any contract restructure. So that's from your 3-year health standpoint. That is what makes the most sense. Will this team do it? I have no idea. I have no clue. No clue what to expect. But the Tyreek question that exists is, do you have an offense without him that you feel good enough about running with throughout the course of this season? And I think that depends on how much work you do on the offensive line. You probably need to draft or sign a reasonable volume player. I mean, you'll have Devon Achane, Tyreek Hill, or without Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, Jonnu Smith. You need another receiving game piece. And I don't think the proposal that we put forth with Josh Palmer and Ben Skoranek was that. So maybe this is, we do get to the draft and we see, and we have an opportunity to draft the Jack Betch from TCU or an Elik Ayumanor from Stanford, and you pull the opportunity there to take advantage of it. And then you spend the spring with minicamp and OTAs and whatnot without Tyreek Hill, because he's still recovering from the wrist injury that Mike McDaniel said at the NFL Combine that they were going to be without. And you take that pivot at that opportunity, and you get all those reps together and you feel good about it, and then you move on and you get what you can. So for as much as all of the reporting and the tea leaves are saying it's so likely that Tyreek's back next year, I get it. But I refuse to look at the numbers game that you're playing here. And unless in a win now window where there is pressure to win amidst your transition that you're going through, and you've already started the transition with some other players, unless you're going to throw your hands up in the air and say, we'll figure it out. We'll do what we got to do. This is the thing that makes the most sense, because the alternative is to look in the crystal ball 12 months from now and see yourselves doing exactly what the New York Jets did with Davante Adams, which was he had no guarantee money left on his deal. It was a massive, monumental salary that he was scheduled to receive as an older player into his early 30s at the wide receiver position. Nobody's going to have a market for it, and you're going to cut him and trade him outright. As far as Bradley Chubb, Tom Pelissero did give us another nugget while we were recording, which is why I'm glad I did happen to save this for the end of the show. But Bradley Chubb's contract, as Tom Pelissero revealed, is saving the Dolphins $16.3 million in cap space this year. Here's Bradley Chubb's contract for those of you who are watching on YouTube. And if you're not, just know it's $19.45 million salary in 2025. And he was scheduled to have a $28.6 million cap hit. I can do the math and tell you 16.3 off of that means he's now on the books for $12.3 million in cap space. Now, they did this in one of two ways. You could say that the Dolphins took a $16.3 million pay cut off of the $19.45 million salary that he was scheduled to receive, which would mean his salary would be $3.15 million. Kyle does math live on the air. Yep. So either they cut his salary from 19 to 3.15, which is possible. And tip of the cap to Bradley Chubb if that's what they did. But if they didn't do that, perhaps they took $10 million off of his salary. And then they took another $8 million of his remaining salary, which would be $9.45 million. And let's say they took $8 million of it and they restructured it like they would a restructure bonus. And it gets added to the prorated money that he has from his signing bonus originally and his restructures that he's made in each of the last 2 years to help the Dolphins become salary cap compliant. If they did that, you would be looking at a $1.45 million base salary. I've now facilitated the same $16 million in savings for Bradley Chubb. Potentially you remove the workout bonus. And now you're at 12.5 from 28.8 or 28.6. So that's the big question I now have is how did they facilitate this? Did they just get a salary cut or did they end up doing a partial salary cut and then convert more of it into a new signing bonus that gets prorated out for multiple years? It's really interesting. Like how I was going to tackle it was going to be something along the lines of, do you do a partial restructure? Well, now we know what the final number is, but we don't know how they got there. Maybe we'll get another Bradley Chubb update tomorrow. That's going to do it for us here today on the show. Looked at some plan Bs for the blueprint, looked at the Tyreek Hill situation, looked at the 3-year salary cap with this budget and the cash over cap element that is on display. And then obviously we have some more news to figure out before the tampering window starts on Monday. So we'll have a busy week ahead of us. If we get any news over the weekend, I'll try to be here for you guys as well. Kyle Krabs, keep it locked in right here on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. Make it a good rest of your day. I'm out of here. Go Fins.